everyone, welcome to this microteach. We're going to be discussing the decade of the 1980s and how John Hughes, in one of his most famous movies, The Breakfast Club, really contributed to the culture of the era. So just for a quick overview of this decade, Americans were coming down from the radicalism of the 1960s and political scandals of the 1970s. They were done with the hippie movement, they were done with free love, they were done with Vietnam, though the Cold War was just beginning. And scandals like Watergate and the subsequent disappointment of the Carter administration left them ready for a change. So because of this, national politics were largely dominated by Ronald Reagan and similar conservatives. Reagan was elected in 1980 and served until 1988, making up most of the decade. His economic policies really focused on cutting taxes and cutting government spending except for money for the military. A recession in the early 1980s gave way to some of the most prosperous times the country had ever seen. And because of this, the middle class was booming and there was a lot more money to spend on entertainment, which is why we saw perennial classics like E.T., the Extraterrestrial, several of the Star Wars movies, and Indiana Jones sequels come out of this time. Meanwhile, one man was pushing the rise of the teen movie. This man is John Hughes. He produced and wrote 6 films about and for teenagers during the decade. And in a conversation with renowned film critic Roger Ebert, shortly before The Breakfast Club came out, Hughes said, "People forget that when you're 16, you're probably more serious than you'll ever be again. You'll think seriously about the big questions." These big questions show up in all 6 of Hughes' teen movies: 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Pretty in Pink, Weird Science, Some Kind of Wonderful, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. They're all great. For the purposes of this one, we're going to be focusing on one of the ones that says the most about the era, and that would be The Breakfast Club. For anyone who hasn't seen it, The Breakfast Club focuses on 6 teenagers at the same high school who all fit into certain cliques. We have Judd Nelson as John Bender, the criminal, Ali Sheedy as Allison Reynolds, the basket case, Emilio Estevez as Andrew Clark, the athlete, Molly Ringwald as Claire Standish, the princess, and Anthony Michael Hall as Brian Johnson, the brain. So Bender comes from a troubled household. During one scene, he acts out his family life for the other 4 characters, and it includes a drunk, verbally abusive father who screams at him and his mother. Domestic abuse is something that became less accepted and more visible in the 1980s. Prior to this time, it was really accepted for a man to beat his wife or his children or to yell at them because they were largely considered his property. But during the 1980s, thousands of programs sprang up around the country to help women who are affected by this. Bender also, as you can see in this photo, introduces the other detention goers to marijuana. And this was a drug that was really targeted by the drug wars of the time and also by First Lady Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. It was associated with burnouts like the fictional John Bender. Allison is the film's quintessential loner. She's a compulsive liar who has no friends and showed up to detention because she didn't have anything better to do. However, she speaks for most of the other characters and teen society as a whole. Adults in The Breakfast Club, like most John Hughes movies, don't end up being the best people, and the teens recognize that. They really don't want to be like them. As Allison says, when you grow up, your heart dies. So Allison also brings up conversation about sex, beginning by lying about how she's a nymphomaniac and teasing Claire. But both girls end up admitting that they're virgins, but that there isn't anything wrong with unmarried sex if they love the person. His attitude's kind of born of the free love of the 1960s and 70s, but like everything in the 80s, it was a little more conservative. Claire's the princess, and she really represents some of the struggles that women had in the 80s. It was, by the time The Breakfast Club was released in 1985, the second wave of feminism was drawing to a close because of arguments within the feminist movement about sex and pornography and morality. The second wave really pushed women's abilities in the workforce and their abilities in education, as well as the rise of reproductive rights. But Claire, at the time, was part of the movement that really was unsure of where exactly feminists and women as a whole stood in sexuality. Claire represents this very much so because of her the pressure that she receives from her peers about whether her status as a virgin and also being called a tease by people like Allison. Her eventual choice in the film to date John Bender, the criminal, and not the jock, and not the jock Andrew, is another sign of Claire's rejecting societal norms. So Andrew, the athlete or jock, calls himself a racehorse at one point, trying to say that nobody really cares who he is or what he does, just as long as he wins wrestling matches. He's really easily cowed by both his father and his coach. He cannot think for himself. And Andrew ends up being the archetype of the dumb jock. This is something that really changed during this decade. Prior to the 1980s, physical strength and that ability was really praised, but this decade saw the beginnings of a shift away from manufacturing and labor-based jobs to more tech-based careers, which would require more nerdy skills. So it was the decade that saw Bill Gates and Steve Jobs emerge and more opportunities for the revenge of the nerds, and it really just was not a good time for people like Andrew. Brian, the brain, shows difficulties on the other side. So he's really the stereotypical nerd. He's under pressure from his parents. He took shop class just to get an easy A and then failed. And he ends up revealing that he was in detention because he brought a flare gun to school, and also that he'd contemplated suicide. Suicide is something that grows dramatically between the 1970s and 1980s, especially in young men. Similarly, the pressure that people like Brian felt led to the rise of the yuppie, or young urban professional, which was young people who would forgo typical signs of happiness, like a nice house in the suburbs, to work hard in the city and continue moving jobs and becoming executives in their companies. The 1980s also saw more people majoring in business than ever before, and it was really based on social status. However, it also championed the individual, and this was something that we saw in the movie The Breakfast Club. So I hope this is a nice introduction to the decade and a good overview, and thank you for watching.